Good afternoon, good day to folks who are tuning in from around the globe. Thank you for joining World Urban Parks for this very special discussion and dialogue on the National Park City movement, looking at it after 1 year.
Hi, Scott, your audio cut out.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
I don't know where it cut out, but I will start from the very beginning and just say thank you for joining us. We're going to have a great discussion today, and let's see if we can jump right into it. We're going to talk about the National Park Cities movement with some great speakers. If you're interested in learning more about World Urban Parks, here's some links where you can follow us. We'd love to have you be a member. Join us if you can't. We are the global community of folks that do a lot of work in our own spaces, obviously, but really get excited with the opportunity to engage, learn from, help, and ask for help from folks from around the globe. And this is a wonderful network and opportunity to meet, share ideas with like-minded folks. So I encourage you to explore joining us. It's a smallish movement, so plenty of room for energy and spaces for you, and we'd love to have you be a part. We have a couple of webinars coming up after this I want to just put out to your attention. One is a very exciting one, is going to be on justice and equity, a very timely discussion.
Hi, Scott, you cut out again right after introducing the title of our next webinar.
All right, so I will try one more time. Apologies. So with that, I will let our speakers begin their presentations and discussions. Each one will give about 5 or 10 minutes on the National Park City movement, and then we'll steer it into a discussion. If you have any questions that you would like to ask them, just enter it into the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen. And I will now shut up to hope that I don't disconnect with you again. And with that, I will turn it over to Dan. Dan, if you want to introduce us and take us forward on the National Park Cities journey.
Hi there. Yeah, my name's Dan Raven-Ellison. I'm a geographer. I'm a former geography teacher, and I live in London, in the United Kingdom. And about 7 years ago now, I started this campaign to make London the world's first national park city, which would be a new kind of national park. And 7 years later, last July, we launched London as the world's first national park city with the support of the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, hundreds of politicians from across the city, but most importantly, the support and goodwill of thousands of Londoners across the capital. This is a big idea that's about rethinking what cities are, what national parks are, maybe more importantly than that, our relationship with nature and how we can have a better relationship with nature. And this is an effort really where there's an invitation being reached out that Alison will speak more about, around the hope there to be 25 national park cities around the world by 2025. And that ambition really began with the idea that maybe there should be a few more national park cities by that point. But I was giving a talk actually in Washington, DC, and there was a guy there who was really making the point that the need for rapid change around the climate emergency, the health emergency, the ecological emergency, the financial emergency, all these things that we know a better relationship with nature can achieve. These things are so great that if we have good ideas like the National Park City, then we should be thinking about how we can scale them up and activate them as quickly as possible. So what is a national park? What is a national park city, rather? Well, fundamentally, it's about taking inspiration from the world's inspiring, remarkable, important, distinctive national parks. I think one of humanity's best ideas, and recognizing what's good about them, that many of them are highly problematic for different reasons, what's good about them, and saying, what can we do to bring this idea into urban environments, to inspire people, to make those environments, cities, greener, healthier, wilder, and to get more people outside. So we can define or think about national parks and cities in different ways, but what a national park city is fundamentally is it's a place that you can explore, you can enjoy, you can improve, you can make better, you can make worse. It's a vision that you can share, just like a rural national park, a contested vision for the hopes and dreams and aspirations for that habitat, that landscape, that community. Thirdly, it's a community, right? It's in London, we talk about having a London National Park City movement, a movement of people. And this movement who have been working to make London greener, healthier, and wilder have actually been doing it in this city for hundreds of years. That's why we've inherited a landscape that is almost 50% physically green, a landscape that is home to about 15,000 species of wildlife, making it one of the most biodiverse regions of the UK, recognizing the diversities of cultures and peoples and practices and activities that we have within this great city of ours, and celebrating those. But also recognizing in that movement that just like in rural national parks, just like in rural landscapes, we face many challenges and threats as well. But what we have is the firm belief that actually within this city and our cities around the world, we actually have the talent, the ideas, the solutions, and the people to do truly transformative things, to improve the quality of not just people's lives, but the lives of the species that we share cities with. But the problem is those solutions aren't being scaled up quickly enough or equitably enough across these urban landscapes of ours. Which brings me on to the fourth part, really, what a national park city is about, which is not the bit that most people in the world will be interested in, but it's absolutely vital, which is it's a way of organizing. It's a way of coming together, sharing those best practices, finding new investment, finding new ways to protect the landscape. So many people will say to me, well, what's different about the idea of a national park city compared to other initiatives? And I think there are some core things that I'd give you. Firstly, it's about seeing people as the solution, not as a problem. Secondly, it's about seeing that fundamentally, I think one of the big problems we have is that there isn't enough demand for the things we want to see more of in cities, whether that's more protection for parks, whether that is more investment into green spaces, whether it is more investment into nature-based solutions, whether it's more outdoor learning in schools, more play on streets. There isn't enough demand for these things politically or financially. And what the National Park City can do, and I'll explain this more in a moment, can increase that demand. It's about recognizing that culture is key. So I am really interested and inspired by and love nature. But for many people, nature is actually quite a niche area of interest. Culture, on the other hand, poetry, music, art, the way we behave towards each other, sport, are all absolutely core to our societies. And it's recognizing that it's through culture and through storytelling and creating stories and identity that we can really do transformative things. Just two more things that make it very different, I think, to other initiatives. That taking inspiration from national parks, fundamentally what a national park is it's a landscape. And when you start thinking about these processes and these behaviors and these opportunities and these challenges at a landscape scale, what it means is that everyone is included. Everyone is included within that area, whether they like it or not, whether they know it or not, whether they're doing good things or bad things, everyone is included. And the challenge and the job for many of us on this call, whether you're in a national park city or not, is to shift the dial so that more and more people are not only aware, but involved and active on agendas around making our cities greener, healthier, wilder. Finally, what I think makes it different is that, it's not about just being an initiative that comes and goes. I think a national park city is really about being around forever. It's for all times. So for me, there's a bit of a simple theory of change that we talk about within the London National Park City around how we want to create the change that we want to see and how we can catalyze good practices and best practices. And one of the biggest ones really actually is around how we can increase people's hopes and aspirations and ambitions and create that demand for more of these things we want to see more of in the city. And we frame that in the London National Park City campaign around two key questions. The first one sets the backdrop of the National Park City idea is what if? And that's about giving people a framework, a way, an ambition to start asking this question about what if things were different because we live in a national park city. So I think about my local canal. What if there are otters in my local canal? What if there are more swings in the parks? What if there was outdoor learning in schools all the time? What if streets were 10 times greener? What if there were more green walls up the side of buildings? We can imagine these different what ifs. What ifs birdsong was louder than the sound of cars, something which experienced more as a result of the recent awful COVID epidemic. But then sets the backdrop of the idea of the National Park City. We then follow up with this tip-pointing question of why not? Why not? So if we live in a national park city, if that's where we live, if that's how we identify as citizens, as businesses, as a landscape, as government, then why not? Why isn't there clean air? What do you mean you want to build in my park? What do you mean you're not investing properly in the local parks? Why are we prioritizing cars over children on streets? Why isn't there more outdoor learning in schools? And where are the otters? Why aren't they in my local canal? Why can't I swim in the local canal myself? And once we get enough people dreaming, and then we get enough people asking why not, that's when I think we can start creating these tipping points where we start seeing some serious progress. What the National Park City does is it creates some serious soft power leverage to not only encourage people to ask those questions and then push for answers, but actually over time, over maybe months and then years and then decades, actually that soft power can transform into quite hard power through the types of politicians that we're electing, through the kind of finance that is available. So the London National Park City, a year on, has done a bunch of stuff despite the challenging times we're in. We celebrated with the launch last year by having a big celebration with the support from the Mayor of London, one of our most important contributors, where nearly 100,000 people came to a National Park City festival, learning about it, getting outside, stand-up paddleboarding, skateboarding, doing theatre and art and all kinds of stuff. We've hired, working with the outdoor brand Timberland, a couple of key members of staff who have unlocked a program of National Park City Rangers. And our National Park City Rangers are people who are super enthusiastic. They are sometimes experts, sometimes just like really, really excited about something, who can take those good practices that we know are taking place in different parts of the city and amplify them and celebrate them and signpost people to them to try and create that energy and the connectivity we need to connect up those ideas. The ambition for a city of 10 million people is for there to be 2,000 rangers in the city by 2025. In response to awareness of the fact that we're predominantly in London a grassroots effort, despite having support from government, we're also going further, and we're going to be shortly announcing a work around having a London National Park City People's Assembly, an assembly of 100 people who will reflect the diversity of our city and be able to help with the governance and steering of the direction of the London National Park City in the future. So we've achieved an awful lot in London, but we've got an awful long way to go. You know, fundamentally, the London National Park City exists because we face problems, we need to overcome problems, and we need to come together to work out how to solve them. So we have not fixed everything, but we've started this journey and we're super excited to share it with everyone on this call and beyond, and hope that you might be interested in how this big idea could potentially work for your city where you are in the world.
Great, wonderful intro, Dan. Thank you for that. We'll turn it over now to Alison, who is on the board of the National Park Cities Foundation. So Alison, take it away from sunny, beautiful, comfortable England.
Hi, everyone. My name's Alison Barnes. I'm a trustee at the London National Park City Foundation, the National Park City Foundation. But some of you might know also that my day job is actually as a chief executive of a, if you might say, normal, should put it in, normal national park. So I'm kind of looking at the concept from two perspectives. But today Scott has asked me to kind of talk a little bit about the global program that we've been working on with World Urban Parks and Salzburg and many others. But I suppose the first question is, so great, this happened in London. What's it got to do with the rest of the world, and why go global? Well, I guess what I would say is that obviously national park as a concept is a global asset in the first place. Obviously, I don't need to tell colleagues in the US, you know, the birthplace of national parks, about that, and how that concept has really endured over the years. I mean, I'm struck by Dan speaking about, you know, the cultural aspect of that, the inspirational aspect of that, and how people like John Muir were the inspirers. You know, man cannot live by bread alone, and all those ways in which our forefathers really linked beauty with our well-being. And that's what really led to the national park movement that we have today. But obviously the idea of national park city, I guess, really disrupts that and makes us think, and really helps us think again about people and the relationship with the environment around us. And so I think it was inevitable this was going to create global interest. And particularly as we move into visions right now and over the past years with increasing development about regenerative cities, doing things differently, having the ideas around protection, enjoyment, and prosperity, or greener, wilder, healthier, whichever way you want to put it. You know, we don't want these trade-offs anymore, and it's helped us really start to think about how I think some people call it restoring the future. And I think, so that the concept of the National Park City has always, through the whole London campaign, as a global city as well, attracted plenty of national attention, because, as I say, National Park is a kind of global property. I think it's the last few years I've been engaged in this, working with World Urban Parks and Salzburg Global seminar to kind of try and put some shape around that. And it's been an absolute delight to work with those guys and all of their contacts across the world. And particularly today, I think, as we've moved into this absolutely unprecedented time of COVID, where the pertinence of national parks and its relationship to health and environments within our urban centres as well really just comes to the fore. Looking at recovery of ourselves, recovery of the economy, recovery of the whole package of things that we need for human life. Certainly the movement of national parks in the UK is 70 years old, and we basically mark the birth of national parks in the UK with the birth of our National Health Service. And I know in World Parks Week, when we're on seminars like this with international colleagues, there's a really clear line between movements around protection of natural and green environments and health. So I think it shouldn't be, again, surprising that this concept is of importance and really flashing red light interest, if you like, to many, many people right now. We've got a lot of rhetoric at the moment around green recovery. I think this is a very interesting way of putting some flesh upon the bones of what that might actually mean. And I think Dan has really picked up some of the things that I think is quite unique about this, and why it does appeal really broadly is because it's about people, and it's about the demand of people for nature, and it's about the stories they tell about the relationship between the landscape and people. And that's an ongoing, forever thing, as Dan said, and that works across a whole landscape. And I think we are all finding that now is a time where we need to retell that story. So Dan and I have, over the years, been talking about this to a number of audiences, and we were fortunate enough to speak in front of the Zoological Society for London, and many of your esteemed academic colleagues will have been with us at that time in that room. And they were talking about HE targets, they were talking about the promise of Sydney from the IUCN, the Sustainable Development Goals, the climate and biodiversity targets, which we will eventually be looking at when we're allowed to come together again after COVID, and nature as a foundation of life. And Dan and I were in this room with all these esteemed, very eminent scientists, and we sort of stood up at the end and went, oh, people, national parks, and felt, you know, very disruptive around that. But I think we were very much what I call the inspiration, the inspiring part of the wiring part that they had spent the whole day on. And I do think there is massive room here for the inspirational side of national parks and national park cities, and how that really connects into some of those really huge agendas that will be coming forward in terms of commitments from international governments over the coming years. We've also been working, you know, pulling on that interest with a number of fora over the last couple of years. So we were fortunate enough to be hosted in both Washington and Canada, and also across in Adelaide, as well as some fora in London over the years. We also spent quite a lot of time in Salzburg with international colleagues and at the Nature of Cities conference, test running our ideas with over 50 nationalities. So we know that some of these ideas really do have resonance, and we can talk to you later about some of the challenges around some of the language. But I'm really pleased to say that a year ago, almost in a week's time, on the 21st of July, we were able to sign an international charter with IUCN, World Urban Parks, ICLEI, and many others, which basically gives expression to our sort of vision for national park cities across the globe. So 25 by 25 cities, which are working in step with the Universal Charter for National Park Cities by 25. So we can talk a bit more about the wiring of that in a minute. There are cities that are considering this, pleased to say. As I've said to you, there's been a huge amount of support and interest for London, and also the international conversation all along. And that leadership has very much come from people. One of the great things about this, I think, is about people asking this what if question, and many what ifers out there, and that's contagious, and it's not, and it's in a good way. You know, leadership from within cities, individuals who have brought together community groups who are able to kind of ask questions and bring together ideas. And we've had a number of campaigns launched formally, including Glasgow, Breda, Newcastle, Cardiff and Adelaide, to name a few. And we do know there are many others across the, well, different continents who want to start that conversation and move towards some formal campaigns. So great to see some of those colleagues on the call today who can share their own experiences. And it's great to be with colleagues from Louisville and Pittsburgh as well, who've shown a lot of connection in with the themes that we've been exploring. So how do I know, Scott wanted me to say something about how do I know if I should begin the dialogue. I mean, I think it's very much not that, I think you just know. I mean, it's a gut feeling that this agenda and this way of working really resonates with you. It's a vision, it's a place. It's about people who want to be greener, healthier and wilder together. Certainly in my locality here, I worked outside of London a little bit. My national park's a little bit outside of London, but we do have some medium-sized cities on my doorstep. And my local town, my local city has signed themselves up to a green charter, and they've become naturally attracted to National Park City because they are already thinking of the sorts of concepts and ideas and landscapes and ways of thinking and enhancing of people that we've been talking about. So I think how you know is that you kind of just know, and the fact that we're all on the call together says to me that there is this family emerging of people who want to take this concept forward. So what we're doing at the moment as a partnership is creating a little bit of structure around that for everybody. And that is going to be a sort of a document that we launch over probably around about October time, which is going to be a sort of guide about how to become a national park city. There's 25 things to do, but the top line things really boil down to 15 steps, which obviously we can talk about a little bit more. But it's all about having a look at that charter that I spoke to you about, which was developed with 50 other international colleagues, plus signing that together, registering interest, and then going on a journey like some of the other cities I've mentioned, and then becoming part of the family really, and committed to that exploration, that continuous exploration about how we could make national park cities really kind of make that difference that Dan spoke about. And I could go on a little bit more about all of those steps, but I'd like to just reassure you today that those are coming. But I think the most important thing for us is building the community and nurturing the family, which is what we're doing today. So it's an absolute delight to be able to join you today. And I hope that at least has given you a little bit of an introduction to the global context. I really look forward to hearing your questions and working with you.
Thank you so much, Alison. That was a wonderful summary. And we'll now turn it over to World Urban Parks Chair, Jayne Miller. And our organization is successful because we have a woman in charge. So I just want to acknowledge that right off the bat. And Jayne, take it from here.
Thank you, Scott. And I am in my my natural environment where I grew up in the Adirondacks in upstate New York, where I gained my love of nature and the outdoors. So I'm thrilled to be able to do this from an environment that is close to my heart and has inspired my professional career. So as Scott mentioned, I am the chair of World Urban Parks, and we are really thrilled and proud to be partners with Daniel, with National Park Cities and Alison, and thrilled that we've been able to work with them to advance the National Park City movement. In partnership with National Park City and the Salzburg Global Seminar, we're really advancing this whole concept of the National Park City movement. What really it does is it puts the whole concept parks and flips that idea on its head. We in the US and other parts of the world have thought of park systems within cities, separate from a city. But this whole concept of a national park cities is really flipping that on its head and looking at the city as a whole and integrating nature and green spaces and advocating for and strengthening flora, fauna, wildlife that grows in cities, and have it being integral into a city. And so it's really thinking differently about park space and parks within cities. It is not, for those of us from the US, my view is it does not challenge our US national park system. That is still really, really vital. But this really looks at cities and creating national park cities within them and having the cities be this vibrant green space where natural habitat and wildlife continues to live. Through the Salzburg Global Seminar partnership that every year leads an effort on Parks for the Planet, we began serious conversations and engagement actually last year at the Parks for the Planet seminar in Salzburg, Austria last May. Dan, Alison, and I were engaged in that, and we are now partners formally with the Salzburg Global Seminar to continue advancing that. One of the really exciting efforts that World Urban Parks is undertaking as part of this partnership is looking at emerging leaders from around the world to help engage them in the work of World Urban Parks, the Salzburg Global Seminar, and National Park Cities, to engage up and coming leaders, particularly from areas of the world that don't have the resources that we do in Western Europe or in the United States. Areas of the world like Latin America, Mexico, Africa, where we can build and strengthen that movement. Also, with what's going on, as Alison mentioned, with COVID-19 and the criticalness of parks and green space that has become evident around the world because of COVID-19, and the inequities that have become even clearer through COVID-19, that the National Park City movement is really aligned with Black Lives Matters and social justice movements in ensuring that everyone, no matter your income, your race, your religion, your sexual orientation, that you have equal access to this critical space that is so important for humans' survival and the survival of our planet. So this is the timeliness of the National Park City movement, and with everything else that is going on today, really is critical, because the National Park City movement is being driven from the ground level. It is about engaging everyone in a city and having those people, rather than necessarily being driven by government, but being driven by the citizens to ensure that everyone has equitable access, and addressing the health inequities, improving air quality, improving water quality in cities. So we're really excited to be part of this. Through World Urban Parks, and I will speak specifically about Scott's work as the chair of the North American region for World Urban Parks, we are working hand in hand in advancing this concept across the US to not only have cities such as Adelaide and Glasgow, but looking at US cities to advance this mission through National Park City. So this is about being bold, being innovative, not thinking around traditional ways of having parks, but thinking about cities and how we can expand the green and nature, and advancing those causes within cities to make our cities livable. If you have not read The Nature Fix, it is a book that integrates research and cities and what cities are doing, like the National Park City movement, to really address the nature fix that is essential for us as humans to not only live and survive, but thrive within urban environments. So Scott, thank you.
Thank you all. We've had some great questions. I'm going to try to put a batch together, and I think we all acknowledge we're leaning into a world that's hurting physically, emotionally, and civically now, and we all feel it acutely regardless of what continent you're on. I'd like for y'all to explore, and Daniel, if you would start, the cities around the globe, they're going to face a double challenge. We're managing a movement that's revisiting structural inequities and power structures, they define decision-making, resource allocation, and likewise a pandemic that's shifting what do our cities allow us to do in this new concerned era of virus. How do we have safe green spaces to all? And then what will come behind that, we all know, is the crushing financial hit to budgets. There's going to be a lot of retrenchment. How do you see the National Park Cities movement engaging these? How do you see it as a potential vehicle to talk directly to power, about power, and sharing power, as maybe we recreate who makes decisions in our cities about what they live and look like?
I think an interesting observation is the number of leaders at different scales throughout many cities that have used COVID-19 as an opportunity to make significant net gains in terms of, for example, introducing walking and cycling infrastructure throughout cities and pushing cars out. So I think that there's indicators there, isn't there, that there are actually politicians who, if they feel that they're able to, and that there's the demand from the public and the support from the public, then they can actually do quite radical policy changes really quite quickly that have a big impact on people's health. And at the same time, what we've seen, I think, is that, certainly in the UK, there's been this parallel story taking place. One about, like Alison says, about the NHS and our National Health Service and its ability to deal with COVID-19 on a critical illness infrastructure side of things. But then in parallel, the inequity of people's access or lack of access to green infrastructure, to nature, to parks, But for us to be thinking more and more about that, I think, is critical wellness infrastructure, critical health infrastructure. And actually we need both. And so far, for whatever reason, so much more investment has been going into the illness side of things. So I think what the National Park City can do is it can help to, like I said in my sort of 5 minutes, was it can help to reframe the city and give strength to people's elbows by saying, well, if we live in a national park city, and if you're the mayor of London, if you're the mayor of the city, if you're central government, if you're local politicians, and you supported this thing, then why aren't we doing more of these things that are going to massively improve my health and my children's childhood development and whatever it might else be. But critically as well, I think it also raises awareness about where power lies. You know, a question that I often get given around the National Park City is, well, if the London National Park City movement doesn't have any formal planning powers, then how can it possibly have the teeth that are necessary to protect green space or to create some of the changes that we might want to see? And what I remind them is, when you look at the national parks around the world, taking inspiration from them, that's what we're talking about, you actually have this combination of different types of power that take place in different national park landscapes. Some very top down, like the federal national parks in the United States, compared to, for example, some that are led by almost entirely by indigenous groups, maybe sheltered by some policy from top-down government. And you know, we have these indigenous groups looking after big parts of the Amazon rainforest or big parts of Australia or Canada. And it's that indigenous wisdom that helps to look after those places. And that's about learning and education and love and the sort of policy that takes place just within someone's own life or just within someone's own family or household, let alone at a more regional level. And if we've seen anything through COVID, in my country anyway, so in New Zealand, I think the experience probably is that a bit of top-down government did very well for that population. In my own country, I think that it's been individuals and their behaviour towards each other, which has been the most predominant form of power, maybe, in terms of helping each other out. So I could go on, but I think that what COVID-19 has done is it's in many societies exposed injustices, clarified some of the things that make us most well and happy in life, and I think will make it easier for some of us to make the arguments that we need more investment and more support for public and green spaces and the activation equitably of them.
Scott, this is Jane. If I may add, coming from a US perspective, just to reiterate what Dan has said, not only with COVID-19 exposing these inequities, and also exposing how critical nature and green space is to our survival as a species. The Black Lives Matter movement, and particularly following the killing of George Floyd in the US, that has led to this incredible protest movement, not only in the US, but around the world, that it has exposed or continues to expose police brutality, particularly in the US and around the country. My view is that is only showcasing, it's not just showcasing police inequities, it is raising issues around inequities in so many areas, and it is being driven by, not by systems, not by organizations, but a groundswell of individuals across the world that are saying the way government and institutions are operating is not okay, and that we are demanding these changes. That is what the National Park City movement is doing on the same kind of groundswell, global level, to ensure nature and access to nature, and that cities really are designed differently than they have been historically around the world.
Scott, if I may, it's interesting to sort of reflect on there's a question here about giving voice to groups across cities and how that kind of joins together to be greater than the sum of the parts. And I will just say that in London, I've seen that happen in front of us in the last 10 years. It's not a quick journey necessarily, but I think if people have enough faith and passion, we can make the change. So my job before the one I do now, I was a director for the government agency for nature conservation in London. And at that time, there were a huge number of amazing groups, which probably we can all think of, but they weren't united in the sort of power that Jayne just described. And I think national parks and the national park movement has always meant, as I said to you, it's a common currency. It belongs to everybody. It's something that we can claim for our own. And it's, like Dan said, it's kind of forever. And that means that it ought to transcend political, you know, changes, etc. And I think this is the exciting thing about that. And I think also the way in which the demand for nature has been harnessed through this movement is what we needed as a sector, because we were very good at saying, like, we put a line around this area, it's really important for nature, we'll protect it. But we weren't thinking about the demand for that provision from people. And I think supply and demand is very much, I think, what makes the world go round in many people's heads. And I think we need to kind of demand other things in the public good. And this is what this is all about. So, you know, I think seeing how it can unfold in front of your eyes through this kind of movement is really inspirational. And I think we need to just have the faith that we can do that, just as our forefathers did with the first national park movement, which created the first national parks. And that is the kind of moment that we are in right now. And we should believe that we have a role to play.
That's great. Let me drill into some of the questions that are coming tactically. And all three of y'all, please address this, because I'm going to try to thematically pull them together. What have we learned from London's experience that folks could deploy in their own communities as these discussions emerge? And what I want to get at particular, the landscape is crowded with people that care about parks, with ideas about how parks and green spaces matter. There's no shortage of interest groups, constituencies, and advocates. How do we create the space to unify through this? What did you learn through London and Salzburg about being collaborators rather than interveners, and giving people the safe space to imagine and create together with perhaps what I would argue that I think we all agree who's on this call, a very powerful vocabulary through national park cities that allows us to go to some neat places?
So for me, there's a thing, I mean, we're definitely on a learning journey, right? And I think we're probably never going to fix all the problems we face around the sort of themes you bring up. But I think that I go back to the point about this being a landscape approach. So many, like, if I just come to my own lived experience, when I think about campaigns to protect the local park in London, there's like 10 people with a pitchfork who turn up to sort of try and protect that park. And no one is really thinking collectively in terms of the local people about the fact that there are other parks like theirs being threatened in other parts of London. And there's something about the psychology of people when it comes to some of these issues that means that they're unwilling then to think of the green spaces as a whole and travel to the other side of town to protect someone else's green space and to see how it's all connected. So there's a fragmentation geographically, politically in people's minds, but also then, for example, issues of connectivity in terms of ecology. How does a hedgehog or a squirrel get from one park to the other? How does a child safely get from one park to the other? And there's one park manager over here and one park manager over there, and they're not necessarily talking or thinking together, and quite possibly because it's the road people who are in charge of the space between the two parks, there's no way of even connecting the two things up very satisfactorily anyway. And then for the imagination of people in the public, you know, things are even more fragmented again. So I could go on, but it's almost like culturally, politically, emotionally, in terms of power, the landscape is fragmented. And the beautiful thing about the idea of a national park is that it brings all people together. Maybe they have different understandings of it. Maybe they have different hopes and aspirations of it. But like Alison says, there's some currency around that, which essentially means that everyone has a stake, right? Everyone has a stake and everyone has a say. And all of us will have experienced this through the national parks that we visited in our own countries, both in terms of the people who inhabit them or who look after them, but the visitors as well. Everyone feels that they've got a part to play. So I think that what I've learned, we haven't completely got it right yet. You know, it's not like there are 9 million, 10 million people in London who are all on mission on the London National Park City, doing incredible things to improve their lives and the landscape, and we've doubled the amount of wildlife in the city. You know, that's not where we are right now. But what I think we do have is an idea and a concept which does not try and take ownership or take control from other people, but just tries to provide some buoyancy, just to lift everyone up, tries to increase the size of the pie. And you know, there's a question from Anne in the comments about the fact that there's lots of other initiatives taking place, and how do you not compete with them? And I think the point is that if we're trying to increase demand for more forest schools together, and trying to increase more demand for more learning in the curriculum about environment together, and if we're trying to protect our local parks together, then that adds up to far more than all of us trying to do it, you know, in a fragmented way in different parts of the world. And in reality, while I'm talking about London, you know, things like more outdoor learning in schools, or rivers that are clean enough to swim in, or parks that everyone feels safe to play in, are issues that unite all of us wherever we are in the world, I think. So why not unite together around these things? And there may be some other terminology, the National Park City, that works better for you where you are in your world. But I think that actually some of the things we're creating, like the National Park City Charter, some of the hopes and ambitions and dreams around that can still apply to other contexts as well. So I think those are some of the key points for me.
Dan, before Jayne and Alison jump in, let me interject one thing. Is there a charismatic story or narrative that you think other cities should think about that carries this value, that carries this message from London that you think is replicable? Sorry, Jayne.
I really think this thing that I've touched on and Alison has touched on around this what if, right? If you're a national park city, or, you know, find your own language that works for your urban conurbation, you know, if you invite people to ask the what if question in that context, then I think that's really exciting and really compelling. If you can then also pull together the forces to then create the frustration and the energy to then actually deliver on some of those hopes and dreams that people have by asking what if. But if people aren't even asking the what if questions, right, then you're probably not going to get the solutions. And the reality is, I think that wherever you are, if you invite an audience of 500 people together into a theatre somewhere, when we can do that again, if you can do that where you are, then you will hear those charismatic voices, whatever you think charismatic might look like, but you will hear those charismatic voices and those ideas, and crucially, that leadership at different scales coming through.
Scott, may I chip in? So there's a question here from Anne as well about how you operationalize the idea. I sort of skipped over the wiring because I was trying to focus on the inspiring, but there's quite a lot of detail around how we actually went about that. And I talked to you about the Universal Charter for National Park Cities, which has got a language, a common sort of vision around it. I won't read it out. I do have it in front of me here, but I could do, if it's helpful in a minute, just a section of it. But there is a sort of anchoring charter, basically, that we have developed together and with other colleagues across the globe, which sort of anchors the idea. And then from that, we have come up with a how to become a national park city process, if you want to call it that, which is one of my worst words ever, is the word process. I kind of can't really stand it, but I guess we need some. But it will be about doing 25 things, okay? So in essence, the very high level 5 steps is about signing the charter, registering your interests as part of a family. It's not kind of marking your homework. It's much more about becoming part of a family, submitting a sort of application, if you like, in terms of how you meet the aspirations of that family, and then, you know, be welcomed by that family, and then launch your national park city. I say that very quickly, but that can be a sort of a number of years of work. And then within that, it's about exploring what that means for your own city, So where are your green spaces? Where are the deficiencies in your green spaces? Where are your wonderful community groups that you already engage with? So it's about also involving people. So one of the things we did in London, which will have different manifestations elsewhere, is about going to community representatives and getting over 50% of them to sign the Charter for London, and making the case with your own communities and your leaders right through to growing that support and keeping that continuous journey going. So there's quite a lot of detail behind this that we will be sharing over the coming months. Although I think today's webinar isn't about kind of teaching the process, but I think there are many things we can learn from each other about how to do that. Adelaide, for example, has been starting to go through that process over the last few years. So we're, you know, really benefiting. In fact, someone's just written something about Australia on the chat, so that's fortunate. You know, we're really benefiting from that, you know, that sharing together about the different contexts. And then, as I said, there are a number of other cities, including Breda, who Dan has worked with quite a lot over the last couple of years, where we are, again, growing that kind of sense of what this means in terms of operations. So it will be, you know, there's not a like, here's the oven ready model, off we all go. It's going to be working together and iterating and being a community. I hope that helps.
If I just interject that very quickly, just to say that, you know, in London, it's very much so. We have the National Park City Foundation, which is a charity that's been set up to help make the London National Park City and other national park cities a success. And really the National Park City Foundation is the guardian of the spirit of that. But then the National Park City then manifests itself in different ways in London. The Mayor of London and London councils play a critical role, like they always have done in the city, and have supported this initiative in different ways. But then, but it's very much so really a grassroots-led program. On the flip side, in Adelaide, it's the Minister for Environment for South Australia who's really spearheading the campaign there, and they'll have far more support from the centre. So the way in which a national park city will be organised and led and inspired in Adelaide may well look and feel very different from London, but actually we're trying to achieve the same thing. So it's going to be very interesting to see how national park cities manifest themselves in different cities, so we can learn from each other and see what works in different places.
I'm just going to talk a little bit about, I know that, you know, there are, one of the things that's happening, for example, in Adelaide, the National Park City movement is being led by the South Australian government, which is different than how Dan and Alison have led it in London. So I think one of the things to think about, this grassroots effort is really critical. How it gets started may be different, however, in other cities around the world. I will also talk a little bit about some work that I have done in the US, both in Minneapolis and in Pittsburgh, addressing many of the same things Alison and Daniel have talked about, but in Minneapolis, through the Minneapolis Park Board, which is a local unit of government that manages the entire park system. And then in Pittsburgh, as the president and CEO of the Pittsburgh Parks Conservancy, which is a nonprofit. But it really was both trying to address racial and economic inequities through parks and access to green space in those cities. Looking at things like health indicators, looking at asthma rates, looking at black carbon, looking at tree canopy, looking at racially concentrated areas of poverty in the city, and really flipping on the head of what historically has been about investing in green spaces and ensuring that there is equal access to green spaces in these cities in the United States, and really changing what has historically been done, not just in those two cities, but in cities in the US, about investments in green and nature spaces that are happening. And so the model of the National Park City is really a critical one, thinking about access to nature and green space, and how cities do it can be done slightly differently But fundamental to that is equitable access to green space and this grassroots engagement, which is what we did in Minneapolis and in Pittsburgh to ensure that all voices were being heard and that we were looking at the true data of different neighborhoods in the cities to make sure that we were addressing them in an equitable manner and that equitable citizen engagement was also happening, so that we weren't just hearing from the traditional voices that we hear from, but doing extensive and really detailed engagement with different community groups to ensure that we were matching the demographics of the city to reach Indigenous, immigrant, African Americans, Latinos across the city, disabled. So there's different ways to think about also how you do this movement depending on your city and how to make sure it happens.
That's great, Jayne. I want to pick that up and go just one quick pivot. How does this movement, we've spoken a lot about green infrastructure and we've got a lot of design comments and accessibility. How does this speak to the software side of our business, that is the recreation programming? How do we speak to sport communities? How do we speak to senior living, senior lifestyle communities? What do you see as the intersection here with that community and those interests?
You know, again, I will speak from my experience. I think ensuring that you're hearing the global voices of your community and that that those segments of your population, the disabled, the seniors, that you look at ensuring that they are engaged. And so that as not only you're hearing about their priorities and interests for access to green space, but they're also involved and engaged in the design of those spaces to meet their needs. It really all comes down to this grassroots, equitable access to nature and green spaces.
Yeah. So Scott, just something on that. I mean, in my experience here, it's very much about that health and well-being agenda. So like Jayne said, you know, we're getting more and more data about what we need for different communities for their health and well-being, whether it be, you know, those who are have inequitable access to green space or others. And certainly the natural health service, as we're beginning to call it here, you know, is really breaking through the dialogue. So how you prevent ill health through recreational offers. I mean, I think it's globally, there's a kind of paucity in investment in green spaces. And I think some of these health benefits are now so much more to the fore. And we are really able to make those inroads to those communities through their inherent connection into preventing ill health as well and restoring people who have had ill health. So I think we're looking at prevent, restore and excel here. So us being the center of excellence with our parks, green spaces, our national park cities for natural health, basically across many, many more people than currently experience it. So I think for me, that's how that connection manifests itself most strongly.
Great. I'm going to go ahead. We've got about 5 minutes left. I want to give each one of our great panelists a chance to wrap up. We'll go Jayne, then Alison, then Dan will wrap us up. I'll put you on the spot though. The one or two things that you want to leave the folks who are tuned in here that they can do, should do, or should be thinking about as they begin to see themselves as leaders in their community on this movement?
So, you know, for me, you know, in the US, what's starting to happen as a result of COVID, and also as a result of protests and the lack of revenue that's coming into cities and governmental entities, as well as the huge expenses that have gone out, are budget cuts. We know historically parks are often the first to be cut and the ones that are to be cut most dramatically. I still argue that even if those budget cuts, and probably the reality of when those budget cuts do occur, that you still can look at how you do your investments in parks differently, that you think about it differently, that you think about addressing them equitably. You can use demographic information. There's data that can go all the way down to the neighborhood level to ensure and push the envelope with elected officials, city administrators, city managers, to really push for those equitable investments and how critical they are for health, wellness, quality of life. Just because budget cuts aren't happening and are likely going to happen across the US and are going to be faced in parks does not mean that you can still not do this work. In fact, I would argue that it's even more critical that this work be done now, and that you put the spin on how spending has been done historically in equitable manners.
Okay, should we just go in line, Scott? Yeah. I mean, I think you've just got to be, you've got to have that belief, really. Not take no for an answer. The fact that we know that people want this and demand this. And I think at this moment, nobody really knows what green recovery really means. So that gives you a head start to be the one that puts an idea in front of them. And I think just believing in the power of people's what ifs and aspirations for their area, because they will, if amplified, they will cut through eventually. It may not be in the next year or in the next 2 years, but to kind of keep going, really, and to, as I said before, see yourself in that position as the sort of John Muirs of this generation, where we are actually trying to put an important change, an important concept into our communities, and just don't give up, really. And I think there is real hope. Systems and finances will come and go, but I think, as Dan said, there are lots of unifying concepts around demand for nature which are really cutting through at this point in time. And we are the people, I guess, who are on this call who can really make that endure. And I'm really feeling positive that I have all of you around me to keep me going. So I think we pledge to keep each other going.
Thank you, Alison. Thank you, Alison and Jayne, for both your leadership and inspiration. I think that as an observation, visiting different cities and speaking to different people who are interested in the idea of their city being a national park city, I think that if we'd started the campaign to make London a national park city even a few years earlier, I'm going to give a really bad sporting analogy now. I'm really bad at surfing. And it's almost like we would have, if we'd started the campaign just a few years earlier, the waves of evidence just wouldn't quite have been strong enough to give us a good wave to surf on. But actually, we kind of jumped up on our board at exactly the right time in terms of all the evidence about why we need to have a better relationship with nature in cities and around the world, and why that's good for us, landscape, and for wildlife as well. The evidence is stronger than ever, the need is stronger than ever, and now is the time to be doing this. And as Alison says, this is really of our time, and you might question where the leadership might come from, and leadership can come from very many different places. And it's interesting traveling to cities where people applaud and they love the idea, and there's conversations that have taken place for 2 or 3 years, and no one's quite sure that they can step forward as the person to make their city a national park city. The chemistry hasn't quite been right to get that sparking. It's happened in a few cities, but there's somewhere where it just hasn't sparked. And what I'd say to you is that if you can see the evidence, and if intuitively this idea of your city being a national park city feels like a good idea to you, sleep on it for a day or a month or whatever you need. And if you think, do you know what, I want to make this happen for my city, then reach out to us, reach out to World Urban Parks, reach out to Salzburg Urban Seminar, reach out to our charity, the National Park City Foundation. And come October, Alison mentioned these 25 things to do, and they're not hoops, they're they're wonderful steps to help you on your journey to becoming a national park city. Easy steps. I think it's probably about 25 steps on an average staircase, right? So it's all about getting to that next floor. I'm going to stop my analogies now. Anyway, the invitation, the hand is out for you, whoever you are, to think about how you could be a leader to become the leader of the campaign that makes your city a national park city. And if you don't think that you're exactly the right person, then think about who could be the people in your city who you could inspire, or who could you put around you to share that leadership responsibility to make it happen for you. And we would certainly love to have those conversations with you to help you make that happen. So any questions, reach out. Any concerns, reach out. Thank you very much for listening to us on this call. And I very much hope that, in 5 years' time, we'll do a check-in and there'll be 50 national park cities around the world.
Great. Thank you, Dan, and thank you all the panelists for this great session. At the close or later tomorrow, you will receive a copy of this presentation. We'll go ahead and include in that the link, or actually I'll go with the screenshot of the National Park Cities Charter if you haven't seen that, and then contact information for our panelists as well as this discussion and dialogue evolves. And Dan, Alison, Jayne, thank you all so much for the positive inspiration. It is so important to hear that, especially today. That great things can happen, and it's simple people like us that make it happen. So it's wonderful to hear your message. Thank you all. I look forward to seeing everyone at our next webinar, which will be on July 27th. And thank you to IU and the Epley Institute and World Parks Academy for the platform, and Kelly and Maggie for all of your help on the technology. We will talk to you all soon, and be safe.
Thank you, Scott.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you.